Hello, everyone. Happy Martin Luther King Day, and welcome to another edition of SportsBeak, episode 42, episode number 2 of 2021. I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
First show in 10 days, and boy, do we have a lot to talk about, a lot to break down. But I want to start things off in the NFL. What a divisional playoff weekend it was. All 4 games provided some excitement. We'll do our SEC countdown like typical, but I'm just going to keep it in the NFL realm, and I'll get started with my surprise. I know I've been high on the Buccaneers on this show, specifically when Zoe Alter's been on and considered them a mediocre team, but I did not predict. You can see in our predictions, I did not think they were going to win that game against the Saints. New Orleans, I thought, with all the rumors of Drew Brees potentially retiring at the end of the season, which is what it looks like is going to happen, that there would be some added motivation for him to reach that pinnacle. And it did not happen. And the Saints really, in the past years, you could have some excuses for their losses, whether it be the Minneapolis Miracle or bad officiating calls in the Rams game 2 years ago and the Minnesota game last year. But there's no excuses for this one. You were home. You even had some home field advantage because a lot of fans in the Superdome, which is something that no teams have been able to have the entire year. You had Michael Thomas healthy and he did nothing. Alvin Kamara did nothing. And Drew Brees threw 3 interceptions. That is unheard of for Brees. And now you're losing to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And it's impressive to see what the Buccaneers did because they got completely outplayed in each of those 2 games in the regular season. And I was watching Get Up this morning, and Ryan Clark was saying that this team, the Buccaneers, they were preparing for this rematch against the New Orleans Saints since back when they lost that second game. Tampa Bay knew they were going to make the playoffs. That schedule with the games against Detroit and Atlanta and Carolina at the end, they had an easy way to end the season. They knew there was a good chance it would come down to a Brees versus Brady part 3. And they fixed all those things on the offense and the defense that failed them in those prior 2 meetings, and they got it done. So I'm a little surprised. I'm putting it as my S, but at the same time, it's Tom Brady. We know what he can do, and now he's going to his 14th conference championship game in 20 years, which is simply amazing. My E, my expectation, Green Bay Packers taking care of business against the LA Rams. I know everybody was kind of hyping up the Rams. Some people saw that as an upset against Seattle, an extra week for Jared Goff's finger to heal. They thought now they were going to be in a better position to actually get that offense clicking because when everybody's healthy, that Rams offense has been solid. And you knew that Rams defense with Jalen Ramsey matching up with Davante Adams was going to be a huge matchup. Arguably the best corner this season against the best receiver this season. But Davante Adams got the best of him, and the Packers got the victory. I'm not surprised. I thought Green Bay was going to carve through the Rams pretty easily, despite the Rams defense being what it is with Ramsey and Donald, among others. But Green Bay's moving on and now gets to host the NFC Championship game against the Bucs, which should be a great game. We'll break that down and do our picks at the end of the show. And finally, in conclusion, Andy Reid is one of the best coaches in NFL history. I know some people have kind of put things down on him, and it took so long for him to finally win a Super Bowl. But those 2 plays he drew up, first 3rd down and 14, with Chad Henne running the ball, nearly getting the first down, and then having the audacity to throw the ball with a guy who has not started a game since 2014 on 4th down and 1 with the ball in your own territory to clinch the game on a throw to Tyreek Hill. I mean, those 2 plays, they completely stunned the Browns defense, which had started to figure out the Chiefs in the 3rd quarter. I'd argue even before Patrick Mahomes got hurt. They responded really well in the second half. So, Andy Reid, kudos to you. And also kudos to the Cleveland Browns. I mean, they got a nice break with Patrick Mahomes getting hurt in the second half, but they kept it close. And the Browns have finally averted 2 decades of heartbreak and have proven why they can be a real contender heading into next season.
Yeah, give the Browns defense a lot of credit. To give yourselves a chance against this Kansas City offense, you had to limit them to points, and they found ways to do that. Even through an injury with Patrick Mahomes, that rush game for Kansas City is still pretty much underrated. We can't forget that. Le'Veon Bell is still talented. No matter what Williams you put in the backfield, both are successful. And let's not forget, that team really knows how to be consistent throughout all 4 quarters, something that Cleveland, if I'm being honest, lacked this season. But as we saw in that game yesterday, they shined defensively through all 4 quarters. Offensively, again, one half-dimensional football, I guess you could say. But at the end of the day, there's a bright side. And let's not forget that team was missing Odell Beckham Jr. with that torn ACL. And I'm not saying Odell is a difference maker, but in regards to the fact that that offense could have been ever such more productive in that game with their number one guy. But I'm going to kind of go to the S, and you kind of briefed it very slightly about Andy Reid being the GOAT of coaching now in the modern era. I'm going to say I'm more surprised in the fact that they passed the football 5 out of the last 7 plays in that game before the knees. Because I'm going to be honest, yes, Andy Reid is a quarterback whisperer of late. He's done a very good job managing football games. And throughout his career, the big thing that he's been very critiqued on the most is the fact that he finds ways to be successful, but then when it comes to playoff games, he's not aggressive enough. But after the Super Bowl victory last year, we've seen aggressive Andy over and over and over again. But in that scenario with Chad Henne, who might have had a terrible, and I mean terrible, Week 17 in his slot start, having any confidence in him to throw the football to seal it is the fact that it's all credit to Andy Reid. And again, you mentioned that 4th down play. That was by far the tipping point for Kansas City, which really makes me think this is a team going back to the Super Bowl. When you can fill all your pieces and put them in the correct holes, as Bill Belichick likes to say, and still find ways to be successful, that's the pairing of a winning football team that's going to have success moving forward. And by far surprising, because in my opinion, I wouldn't have passed the football, I would have probably ran it there. But Andy Reid, regardless, making a big issue into a successful matter. And I'm excited to see the Buffalo Bills take on Kansas City next week in the AFC Championship game. Now, you mentioned the New Orleans Saints and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Eddie, if you remember when we first did our preseason predictions, I said actually what was exactly going to happen. The Saints were going to take the first 2 regular season games, and then Tom Brady would show up strong against New Orleans in the playoffs and ultimately advance themselves into another round. Obviously, I assumed they were going to face in a wild card round. However, this time 1 week later in the divisional round. And I'll tell you what, the way you beat the New Orleans Saints isn't the passing game. This is a team that prides itself on rush defense and has a consecutive game streak snapped by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, might I add, of consecutive games not allowing 100 rushing yards. But yet the Bucs attacked their core of the defense, especially that defensive line. I believe it was 67 rushing yards for Leonard Fournette, followed by, I believe it was 62 rushing yards for Ronald Jones. That alone above 120 yards, and that excludes the other 30-yard rushers they had behind, along with a good game by Tom Brady. To me, that was kind of expected. Tampa Bay has been really, really aggravated, I guess you could say, about that loss to New Orleans earlier on the season, and the fact that they got swept. It's hard to beat a team 3 times, and that's very apparent here in the NFL. Big credit to Tampa Bay, big credit to Bruce Arians. And next week in the NFC Championship game, obviously I know it's not fitting for Drew Brees that his last game is going to be against one of the best quarterbacks of his own era, and arguably 2 of the greatest quarterbacks of all time this league has ever seen. And now you're going to see arguably this year's MVP of Aaron Rodgers versus the greatest of all time of Tom Brady next week for the NFC Championship game. And Rodgers wants a lot of vengeance after losing to that San Francisco team last year. And that team as well in the red zone looks as hot as ever. But in conclusion, I'll tell you what, no matter who makes the Super Bowl this year, unlike last season where you can kind of pick who's going to make the Super Bowl, any of these 4 teams are more than worthy and are going to put on a good matchup this year. The Bills' offense, electric. Yes, the defense has had its quote-unquote collapses, but if you saw what they did against Baltimore, who was by far the hottest offense in the NFL, and I understand Lamar Jackson got a concussion, but even prior to that, to hold that offense to 3 points in the first half is something that is absolutely miraculous. That team if they can prove, and listen, everyone said to the Buffalo fans, especially this year, that team cannot live against big football teams. They already proved it now against Baltimore. If they can stun Kansas City and play an effective game all 4 quarters, I would not be surprised if we're talking about the Buffalo Bills being a Super Bowl champion this year. That team's been a surprise, and they've really progressed from start to finish this year and proving that the AFC East isn't a weak division. They're just a team that's really gotten better and have really improved through that acquisition of Stephon Diggs, especially offensively. You look at the Kansas City Chiefs, and again, I already mentioned it. This is a team that looks like it's progressing towards another Super Bowl run. Whether they win or not, that doesn't matter. But it's the fact that that football team is good from start to finish. You rejuvenate a career of Le'Veon Bell, for example, who had really disappeared with the New York Jets. And that defense, especially with Steve Spagnuolo, continues to be aggressive and find ways, even with not the best players defensively, to be consistently good. This AFC Championship game in particular is going, and I mean going, to be a shootout. I would expect offensively, but right now, in my opinion, Kansas City, not because of their record, but just because of their experience, may have the upper hand slightly going into next week. And then the NFC Championship side, I already mentioned it, the most consistent red zone offense of the Green Bay Packers, Aaron Rodgers, is going to be firing, and he's going to be angry. And let's be honest, who wouldn't want to see Aaron Rodgers in another Super Bowl, and might I add, face his arguably biggest foe of Tom Brady? Let's not forget the big advertisements about 2-3 years ago when these two faced off, when Brady was back on the Patriots, of the battles of the greatest of all time. Well, now we're going to see it for sure next week. And really, I expect all 4 of these games to provide a bunch of offense, especially with the fact that the Rams, that were the number 1 defense, are now gone. To me, these are all very balanced football teams, Eddie. And it's going to make predictions hard. But like I said prior, no matter who makes the Super Bowl deserves it. I don't really think we have this many seasons where we could circle 4 or 5 teams that deserve to be in the big game.
Yeah, in past years, I can think of a couple, for example, where there are teams who advance to the conference championship that you just know are not going to make the Super Bowl. The Minnesota Vikings 3 years ago when they had to take on Philadelphia. Going back a couple years before that, Carson Palmer and the Cardinals against the Panthers in the NFC Championship game. Both of those occasions, those teams got absolutely walloped in the conference championship, and I don't see that happening in either of these games. We'll pick them at the end, but one thing I do want to say that we have to consider is Patrick Mahomes' health after he got banged up against Cleveland yesterday. And you wonder if he's going to be available. They're going to do everything they can to make sure he is available for that AFC Championship game. But that's certainly going to be something interesting to watch throughout the week. And one other thing I want to say about those 2 games, you saw how, and you were alluding to, how Tampa Bay responded to those regular season losses against New Orleans and bounced back. Well, both of these games on Sunday are rematches of regular season matchups. Buffalo got crushed by Kansas City the first time they matched up because Kansas City, instead of throwing the ball, ran the ball all over their defense. So if Kansas City can do that again, especially with an injured Mahomes, that's something great. But Buffalo's defense is going to adjust because they've done such a great job bouncing back after losses this season. And on the other side, Tampa Bay and Green Bay, Aaron Rodgers had that awful game against the Buccaneers, and there's so much motivation for the Buccaneers, not just for Tom Brady to prove that he's the reason the Patriots dynasty was so successful for the past 2 decades, but also the prospect of finally having a team host a Super Bowl game. It's crazy to think that it's been 55 years and it's never happened, and now Tampa Bay is right on the doorstep, 1 win away from getting to play the Super Bowl at Raymond James Stadium. So much added incentive, and also, of course, that we talked about last week with Zoe, guys like Antonio Brown, Leonard Fournette, amongst others, who are really looking for that career resurgence. To get back to the big game and playing the Super Bowl would be absolutely crucial for guys like that. But one thing I do want to mention, and we can discuss now on the NFL front, 4 teams were eliminated, and the one I want to focus on are the New Orleans Saints, because this is now 4 years in a row that they've been eliminated before making the conference championship game. It's the most wins ever in a 4-year span for a franchise that did not even make a conference title game any of those 4 years. And you assume the way it's trending that this will be Taysom Hill's team moving forwards, but you don't know because there's so many quarterbacks coming in the draft. Is Taysom Hill the viable option going forwards? I know in small spurts he's solid, but they like using him, in all these different ways as a receiver, as a runner. I don't know how Sean Payton really plans to settle this out, but I want to ask you about the legacy of Drew Brees because I've always felt when you look at the statistics, Drew Brees is one of the all-time greats, and he's always overshadowed by other quarterbacks of this era. Not just Tom Brady either. I'm talking about Peyton Manning, talking about even Ben Roethlisberger, Aaron Rodgers. People tend to forget about Drew Brees. It's almost as if he lives in obscurity in New Orleans, but other than these 2 seasons now that he's had these injuries, basically every other year, he was a 4,000 to 5,000 yard passer, and New Orleans wins 10 games at least every single year. So where do you think Drew Brees stands as an all-time QB, and what do you think the next steps are for the Saints heading into 2021?
I mean, at the end of his career, obviously, yes, he doesn't match to a Tom Brady in terms of success in winning the big game. But in my opinion, Drew Brees, when it's all said and done, I don't really count any of these last 2 years, not because of the injuries, but because of the age and the regression. The fact that, let's not forget, Drew Brees used to throw 500 passes a year. He was a pure gunslinger and a special athlete from start to finish. Let's not forget that Drew Brees was told that he probably went last as a starting quarterback in the NFL because of his height. So he's a natural phenomenon, to say the least, in terms of what we see in the NFL today. And, give him credit. He's by far one of the greatest passers we will ever see in the history of this game. And to what you mentioned, yes, he has been overshadowed by some of the other great quarterbacks. But in my opinion, Drew Brees, when it's all said and done, is the top 5 quarterback of all time. And I'll even make the argument that he could be the greatest passer of all time. Now, when it comes to the end of Aaron Rodgers' career, we could be debating something else because, listen, if I'm being honest, Aaron Rodgers has done something no other passing quarterback has ever done in their careers in terms of protecting the football and finding ways to be consistent. But, Drew Brees, he makes deep throws look easy. He's found ways to make bad targets look good. And yes, don't get me wrong, he's had Michael Thomas here towards the end of his career, and sometimes he's relied on him maybe a little bit too much. But that doesn't take away the fact that Drew Brees has found ways to win football games, be a good, effective quarterback in the NFL his entire career. And even when the Saints were bad, remember that brief little stint, Eddie, he still found ways to make that offense good. And when you have guys like that, no matter when they're struggling, that means something and shows how special of a talent he was. I really think there's no debate. Top 5 quarterback of all time and first ballot Hall of Famer by far.
Yeah, totally. He's so underappreciated, it feels like, for all that he's accomplished and still being a great passer. And I like how you made that distinction. It's almost like when there's the NBA debates about the greatest of all time, it's not just about the greatest player. You can also consider like the greatest scorer, and you could argue that that's Michael Jordan, but you might not think of him as the greatest all-around player. You might make the argument about LeBron James. I think it's a similar thing in the NFL with Drew Brees because in terms of just passing the football, I think Drew Brees is better than Tom Brady, especially throwing it deep throughout his career. But Tom Brady has proved to be the more successful QB, the better leader, and I think the better in-game play caller. Tom Brady made a lot of those calls yesterday on RPO plays to hand the ball off on this and those were some gutsy decisions too, because you knew how well the Saints have covered the run the entire season, yet Tom Brady was able to see that it was clicking for whatever reason for Tampa Bay, that they had game prepped better than New Orleans heading into that game yesterday, and he did not really rely on himself. I believe he only had 198 passing yards for an offense that was clicking on all cylinders. It was all about the run game with Fournette and Ronald Jones. And I mean, these aren't Ezekiel Elliott's out here. These aren't the most elite running backs. These are guys who are power backs that were able to split right through that Saints defense, and really surprising and quite the distinction from what we saw at the beginning of the season. But we'll get back to the NFL at the end of the show for our picks. But I want to talk about the NBA because, of course, the blockbuster trade for the Nets to acquire James Harden. And it's crazy how quickly everything happened because there were rumors about Harden getting dealt to the Nets or to Philly before the season started. That kind of died off when the offseason ended. And then the Rockets get crushed by the Lakers on Tuesday night. James Harden has a press conference after the game where he basically says that he's done everything he can for the Rockets, and not very nice when talking about his teammates. And you could tell that was pretty much the breaking point for him in Houston after 9 years with the team. And within hours, this deal had been completed. But before we actually talk about how Harden fits in with the Nets, there's a lot of weird moving pieces that happened in this deal that there's got to be some frustrated teams. Now, first off, I mean, very unfortunate with Karis LeVert discovering he has a mass in his kidney. That's why that James Harden was held out of practice on Friday. They still had to finish out the deals on, the final pieces of the trade after discovering that. For the Nets, it's almost a lucky break because if this trade had not happened, then they would have still had Karis LeVert and then been without both LeVert and Dinwiddie for likely the remainder of the season and not had that superstar, which could also lead to Kyrie Irving not wanting to play and having to put everything on Kevin Durant's back. Of course, we wish Karis LeVert all the best and that everything goes well for him. But, of course, Indiana has to be frustrated. I mean, you knew Victor Oladipo did not want to be with the Pacers anymore. There were those reports where he was literally going up to players post-game last season and telling them, I want to be on your team. Why that's not tampering and some of the things Doc Rivers said about Kawhi Leonard on TV that's a discussion for another day. But the fact of the matter is the Indiana Pacers got thrown into this trade just to add a little more incentive for the Rockets. And now they're in such a tough bind. The Nets tried to help them out, gave them a second-round pick for 2024 and some money to compensate, but that doesn't really add much to the table. So that's the first item of business. Second issue is the Cleveland Cavaliers. There's a recent report that I saw in Bleacher Report about Kevin Porter Jr. apparently throwing food in the locker room because Taurean Prince was given his locker. So there's clearly some drama in Cleveland. And then finally, the most interesting one is that the Philadelphia 76ers apparently had a deal done and had even notified Ben Simmons' agent that Simmons and Matisse Thybulle were going to be dealt in addition to a couple first-round picks for Harden, and then the Rockets never called them back. So there was clearly a lot of miscommunication between teams. But I kind of feel like this sort of fits in with the whole pandemic, that it's very hard, sometimes with communication with everything that's going on right now. But fact of the matter is, the trades happened. James Harden is with the Nets, and in game one, he's surely impressed. A triple-double, going along with 42 points for Kevin Durant, 20 for Joe Harris, and the Nets got the win over Orlando. And it's interesting because I'm a Nets fan. I've been watching this team all season. And those first couple games with Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant, you could see some disconnect between them. But Durant and Harden, despite not playing together for almost a decade since back in 2010 with the Oklahoma City Thunder, it's like they never missed a beat. And they went so well, complementing each other so well. And I really think James Harden is going to be a great fit in Brooklyn.
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree. I mean, let's be honest. When we talked about this, I believe about a month ago, we really thought this trade was never going to happen, especially with the Dinwiddie injury that the Nets ended up suffering from. And give them credit. I'm a little bit worried, if I'm being honest, based on previous history, about dealing first-round picks, especially multiple first-round picks for years to get superstar talent. The Nets have done it before, obviously, with that big deal to get Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, and so on. But in this scenario, it's worth it for James Harden. Listen, you already have Kevin Durant, who is an absolute superstar. When Kyrie Irving isn't, arguing about politics and actually wants to be on the basketball court, that team suddenly has a really big three. And on top of it, too, in terms of the depth aspect, yes, I know they're not the strongest in-depth team right now after that trade, but there are still some players that can complement that basketball team into a big title contender when it's all said and done on the East. Harden, by far, that first game, impressive. But I do want to mention this aspect that made no sense to me in regards to the trade to Cleveland in particular. Obviously, you mentioned the Kevin Porter reaction. I found that, in my opinion, hilarious. Not the fact, but it's just it makes sense in regards to the fact of certain reactions and the lack of communication. But the trade part to me that made no sense was sending Jared Allen over. Listen, you already have Andre Drummond, who, might I add, is already averaging 18 and 13 to open up the year. You add another center now. All right, sure, you can make the argument Jared Allen to play power forward, but what progression does this make? Does this mean you're going to trade away Andre Drummond now after you just gave up a good little bit for him last year? Or does this mean the aspect of, all right, we're going to have two big men, and we're going to hope our defensive game is going to get a little bit better because obviously, Jared Allen can get his fair share of blocks and rebounds. But just, again, the trade makes no sense in terms of progression because it now leaves a bunch of what ifs. And if, let's say, Kevin Love is to come back, what does this mean now for Kevin Love? There's so many aspects that just make no sense for Cleveland and why they were even involved in this trade. But yet they were. And, for the Indiana Pacers, big thing getting Oladipo out the door. But to me, this created so much mayhem that was really unnecessary, especially for the 76ers who, listen, in the big picture, I understand the process hasn't worked out the expectations, but I think you're a lot better off keeping Ben Simmons anyways than trading him away along with a couple of first-round picks. For Doc Rivers, just do what you do best. You're a good coach. Let James Harden be. Brooklyn's already a team of its own. And let's be honest, Eddie, in the next 2 to 3 years, that team's going to disappear again with just the fact that you can't keep stars on your team in today's basketball era forever. You got to play the game how it's dealt. And again, big win for the Brooklyn Nets in regards to this trade. But down the road, it could really hurt them, just like a couple other teams in this trade.
Yeah, I really feel bad for Jared Allen and all this because he'd really fit in well with the Nets. And now I really don't know what they're going to do. Playing Kevin Durant at center is absurd, especially against teams with actual centers. Jeff Green cannot rebound the ball, and that leaves DeAndre Jordan, who makes some very glaring errors sometimes, and Claxton, who has not played yet this season, as your only true two centers on the roster. I know if Dinwiddie hadn't gotten hurt, they probably would have kept Jared Allen and traded Dinwiddie instead in that deal so they could still have a big man and it would have balanced out financially and talent-wise. But for Jared Allen, too, you talked about how Cleveland has just this surplus of big men now. They have 5 power forward or centers on that roster who are starter-capable players now. They have Drummond, Jared Allen, Kevin Love, Larry Nance, and JaVale McGee. Like, those are 5 people who can start at the 4 or the 5. I mean, in some ways that's a nice problem to have, but at the same time, you got to have in this era of the NBA, you got to have people that can play outside the post. And especially with Jared Allen and Drummond, these aren't like the new era centers who are going to be pulling up from 3. These are guys that are strictly down in the painted area. So I don't know what the situation there with Cleveland is. And the Nets, here's the deal. I don't agree with the people who are comparing this to the trade in 2013 because that was for guys who were failing at the end of their career. Kevin Garnett was literally at the very, very end of his career. Paul Pierce, I know he had another couple good years with Washington, but he was on the back burners, and Jason Terry was almost 40 at that point. You're getting James Harden, who is still in the prime of his career, has won an MVP, and has been one of the league's leading scorers each of the last 3 seasons. I know there are people who criticize his defense and also criticize the shape that he showed up in at the start of the season. But fact of the matter is, much better player and much better deal than you got last time. And fingers crossed that those draft picks that you gave up, it's not like the last trade, because the 3 draft picks that they traded last time turned into Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and Colin Sexton. I mean, those are 3 very talented NBA players that would have fit in great with Brooklyn instead of having Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce for a couple of years. But James Harden is way better now than that cavalcade was a few years ago. And I think it's worth it for the Nets to try to make this move and invest in their future. Invest in the present, not in the future. Kind of upset about giving up Jared Allen, but if you want to win a championship, you need that duo or that trio of stars. And at this point, I don't know how much you can get out of Kyrie Irving, because he just seems to complain about everything. I've been reading articles about how now he doesn't necessarily like Steve Nash. Well, you're the person who requested them to hire Steve Nash in the first place. And then he was also upset that they didn't come to him to approve the James Harden trade. Well, how about you show up for something for the first time in 2 weeks? That's why you didn't get asked about the trade, because basically Kevin Durant now has to run the show while you're busy being Kai Irving in some Zoom for some congresswoman in Brooklyn. Like this is not, a hit at Kyrie Irving for what he likes to do, but he also has to understand that if he's not showing 100% commitment to the basketball team, they're not going to give him complete oversight of everything that's going on, because Kevin Durant is running the show when Kyrie Irving's not around. So that's basically the fact of the matter. But Brooklyn Nets, I think this is a good deal for them, and I'm really excited to see how these guys mesh. One other interesting thing I noticed was Harden and Durant were on the floor at the beginning and the end together, but in the second and third quarter of that game against Orlando, it was either one or the other. Because the one concern everybody has is Kyrie Irving and James Harden on the court at the same time. I mean, who's going to hold the ball? Who's going to take the shots? I think we're going to see situations where Kyrie Irving and Durant are playing together like they did at the beginning of the season. And then you have Harden coming in with that second unit. We know the bench is weak and depleted after everything they had to give up in that trade. And I think Harden playing in that second unit can sort of work and make this team strong, because if you have all 3 of those stars on the bench at the same time, that's a very concerning situation, because there's nobody really who can score on this Nets team that isn't in that starting 5. So it's some tough choices that they have to make going forwards.
The thing that I really think that's going to happen in that scenario, Eddie, is that obviously we saw with James, working that second unit a little bit. I really think the way Nash is going to work this, assuming Kyrie Irving comes back at one point or another, is that I think we're going to see 2 of them on the floor at once, and he's going to try to cycle up the rest between all 3 of them. Because obviously, again, there's no denying that bench is weak, but they have the capabilities now of at least sharing the rest wealth, as you could say. If they want to first start off, let's say, getting Kevin off the floor, turning around, giving him, his 3-4 minutes in the first quarter of rest before bringing him back in, and then they take Kyrie Irving out, because the beautiful thing about this Tyreek, oh my goodness, I almost said Tyreek Harden, James Harden trade, is that he could play point guard. That's the thing about James Harden that's beautiful, is that he could play both guard positions and at an elite level. So I think the fact of the matter is that you're going to see an alternation between all 3 to make sure Nash has both on the floor, or at least 2 of them on the floor at once, mixed in with that second unit. That's going to create the ultimate success, in my opinion. It's just a fact of the matter of, do you have more injuries, might I add? Hopefully not to your biggest stars of Harden or Durant. Obviously, we know Kyrie Irving has battled with his fair share of injuries. And as we can already tell, this team, with just the 2 of them, can still win basketball games. But you're going to need to be healthy moving forward, going towards the big picture. And that's really the big difference right now for the Nets from start to finish.
So I want to transition a little into baseball here. We didn't talk about baseball at all in the last show. And since then, it's been a couple of big moves in baseball. First off, with the Mets, Francisco Lindor and Carlos Carrasco, big additions for this team. I know Lindor is only for 1 year right now, but Steve Cohen is the owner, and I do have faith that they can get a long-term deal done. And Carlos Carrasco, I mean, he is a gutsy pitcher. It's great to have him back, after his health scare, and then comes back last season and was really elite in the games he started. And it adds some more depth to that Mets rotation, especially with Noah Syndergaard not coming back until the All-Star break, likely. So now you've got DeGrom, Stroman, Carrasco, and David Peterson as your first four. It's really, really good and really comforting. And the one thing that makes a nice distinction, thinking about, let's just compare this to last year. The two veteran pitchers the Mets brought in were Michael Wacha and Rick Porcello, who were both coming off of brutal seasons. Carlos Carrasco and now Stroman, prior to sitting out of 2020, they're coming off of great campaigns. These are guys that, yeah, it's still a little high risk, but these are guys you can actually still have faith in because they at least pitched well last time they were on the mound, not like Rick Porcello, who had the highest ERA in the entire major leagues in 2019. I don't know what they were expecting to get out of him in 2020, but I'll ask you about that trade and also the Yankees making a move for Corey Kluber.
Well, let's start off with the Mets deal, and I'll tell you what, the trade for Lindor is especially huge. Listen, we all assumed during this offseason at some point the Mets were going to make a move. It was just a matter of who were they making the move for? Was it going to be DJ LeMahieu? Was it going to be Trevor Bauer, which, who might I still add, very well still could become a New York Met? The hopes aren't out the window just because of this trade. And, you look at it, Lindor was the big acquisition. Listen, I really feel the Mets, they've had their fair share of drafted talent. They've had their fair share of shortstops throughout the system. But at the end of the day, none of them can beat Francisco Lindor. You got a switch hitter, something that might I add, the Mets really needed in their lineup, in my opinion. You got a guy that can play defense to an elite level, and there's no denying the talent he has, especially as a capability of being maybe that leadoff hitter as well, or a hitter that can complement behind Jeff McNeil in that lineup that is now provided for the Mets. I think that deal is huge. It was a must for Steve Cohen. And now moving forward, you also help that rotation out. Listen, if they get Trevor Bauer, Eddie, and I mean this seriously, that may be the best 5 rotation when Noah Syndergaard comes back we've seen in a long time. Imagine this one. Your number one pitcher, Trevor Bauer, or actually, Jacob DeGrom. I can't take away anything from DeGrom. DeGrom's your number 1, Trevor Bauer your number 2. You make Marcus Stroman your number 3, Carlos Carrasco your number 4, and Syndergaard your number 5 coming back from injury. Assuming Syndergaard's back to the elite playing level he once was, even if you get a average Syndergaard, a 4-point-something ERA Syndergaard, it's still not bad at all. That is by far an elite rotation, more dominant than the Dodgers in the NL, and now all they have to do is really help that bullpen. Listen, the Mets offense wasn't bad at all. They led the major leagues in batting average last year. That offense can hit. It was just a matter of getting that big player in big moments. And also, don't count it down on George Springer either in that outfield aspect. It looks like Springer is starting to close in towards something with a team or another within these next few days. So I really expect this to be huge for the Mets. And I know we've said this in past years, Eddie, where we think that they're going to win the NL East. This year, realistically, if you get another top free agent and don't win the NL East, it's going to be a little bit upsetting because this year is by far the best Mets team we've seen in a while since that World Series run. And the Yankees, this was kind of expected. Corey Kluber coming over, an underrated deal, might I add. Let's not act like Corey Kluber isn't a bad, or I should say, is not a good pitcher. He's battled the last 2 years with injury. Being with Texas was just kind of, a brief run of, trying to deal with the injury that he faced. And now he should be healthy for this new year. When he left Cleveland, he was still a dominant pitcher, battling for a Cy Young. So the fact that the Yankees can get an undervalued deal for him is absolutely huge. But my question really for the Yankees moving forward is this. How are you going to fill out that rotation? Are the Yankees going to bring back Masahiro Tanaka? Because in my opinion, the fact that Tanaka is telling you he's going to go to Japan if he's not a Yankee really makes the worth of him, being a free agent, kind of worthless in my opinion. I think that they should bring him back. Listen, I understand Tanaka is getting old and he's not that superstar pitcher that the Yankees thought that they had when they first signed him, but he's a lot better than the options that are out there in the free agent aspect. And to be honest, I think he's a lot better than James Paxton. I really think the Yankees should re-sign him to bring him back and then ultimately focus on that bullpen. Because listen, you can make all these trades, you can sign whoever you want, but the true problem for the New York Yankees is that bullpen. They're aging. There's no youth. There's no progress. It's been the same aspect every year for the last 3 years. You eventually lose to the team that goes on to the World Series, and typically it's Aroldis Chapman allowing a home run late in the ball game that makes the big difference.
I mean, it's happened 3 different times in just the last few years. It's tough, but I really do agree that Masahiro Tanaka is essential. I know he's not, like you said, not the pitcher that the Yankees first expected when he was coming from Japan and hyped up literally for months. But there's a lot of injury concerns too with this Yankees rotation. And I don't know how much pitching depth this team truly has if they got to it. We know they still have so many great offensive prospects, but they do not have a ton of great pitching prospects. And you don't have that reliable of a bullpen. And there's so many questions with injuries other than Garrett Cole in that rotation because James Paxton always gets hurt. Corey Kluber, he's pitched 36 innings in the last 2 years. I know he was elite before that, but he's barely towed a major league rubber since 2018. And then Luis Severino, I know he's talented when he's out there, but you don't know how much you're going to get from him because he's been out just for so long. And Masahiro Tanaka is someone who stays healthy and is at least reliable to keep out there on the mound. I think keeping him is essential. And like you said, the Yankee bullpen is getting old. They're not the old 3-headed monster from about 5 years ago. It's a lot of old guys who have been there for years, and they cannot really bank on that in the American League. Now, just shifting quick. Wait, do you have something to say?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, well, let's not forget this, too. You mentioned the Yankees' depth. Let's not forget, though, that they bring back Domingo Germán this year after his whole, domestic abuse incident. And he was good for the Yankees before he left. We'll see what he has left on the tank. The big thing, though, is that the Yankees had to make a decision of, do you bring back James Paxton or Masahiro Tanaka? Because let's not forget, Paxton's the free agent as well. I personally do not see him coming back to the Yankees. I think that was a wasted trade, in my opinion, just to Sheffield, even though it's been brief. He found some success this year, and in my opinion, Seattle won that trade over James Paxton because Paxton's been mostly hurt and hasn't done much for the Yankees in his short tenure. But when it's all said and done, the Yankees have a lot of options. It's who's going to be consistent. And when there's so many injuries and so much time lost, you don't know what you're getting in return, which really starts to make me worry because really Corey Kluber does fall under that category too. He missed a lot of time being in Texas. Luis Severino, I think he'll be okay, but he's had his critiques as a starter, rather he's healthy or not, in terms of longevity and consistency. Jordan Montgomery's all right. He's a good, 5 guy. He's been consistent, but realistically, do you see him as a 6th guy in a rotation or a bullpen arm? I don't know. And same thing with Domingo Germán. You don't know what you're getting. And I can't forget Deivi Garcia, who, don't get me wrong, was arguably the most consistent thing the Yankees had outside of Garrett Cole all last year. But he could face a sophomore slump. So I don't really know what to expect out of that rotation, other than the simple fact that if you're a Yankees fan and there's no other moves, you better start flipping a coin because to me, this is a team that's too complacent. And to be honest, this year is well far out of reach of World Series expectations.
Yeah, and you mentioned this Seattle Mariners, just quick anecdote here. The last 2 years, Seattle has completely fleeced both New York teams. The fact that in a pair of deals, they've gotten Justice Sheffield, Justin Dunn, and Jared Kelenic for an injured Paxton, a roided-up Robinson Cano, and Edwin Diaz, who just cannot be consistent on the mound. They've really set themselves up. And I know the Seattle Mariners have not had much success over the past 10 to 15 years, but all three of those prospects paired with Kyle Lewis, who really exceeded expectations last season, both as a hitter and as being one of the top defensive outfielders in the entire American League, the Mariners are in good shape to start trying to make some moves, especially with the expectation that the Astros are going to start to come back to the pack a little bit. Oakland, they're going to soon face an issue with some of these young, talented guys that they have on a budget that they're going to want to be paid more. And we know throughout history, Billy Beane does not like paying people. So, and Texas and the Angels, there's not much to expect there. So Seattle's in a nice spot. But last thing on baseball, I just want to say, with the National League, I really think it's going to come down to 4 teams. I don't think right now there's anybody in the NL Central who's going to compete for a World Series. I think it's going to come down to the Mets and Braves in the East, the Dodgers and the Padres in the West, and it's going to be essential that for any of those 4 teams to win their division, because I'm going based off the assumption that the major leagues will flip back to their old playoff format for 2022 with 5 teams. You don't want, for example, for the Mets or the Padres to be in a situation where they have to play in a 1-game playoff game with DeGrom against Yu Darvish in a wild card game, because that, as elite as both those pitchers are, that's such a tough position to be put in. So it's really essential for one of those 4 teams to really try to win the NL East or the NL West. But 2 more topics to get to. I want to briefly touch on, because there's just been so much happening in the sports world, college football national championship on Monday, Alabama all over Ohio State. How does this add to Nick Saban's legacy? Now his 7th championship, 6th with Bama, and Ohio State, who had really handled Clemson, just had nothing for Alabama in that game.
I mean, in the aspect of how this adds to Nick Saban's legacy is as simple as the answer in the NFL for Bill Belichick. Listen, it's not easy in college football, as much as it seems in today's era of having consistent powerhouses, to continue to be good. But ever since Nick Saban showed up and turned a terrible Alabama program at one point into a dominance in the SEC, is something miraculous. Listen, even when he was an NFL coach, there was no denying the smarts and the skill Nick Saban had as a coach. It was the human aspect that was a little bit questionable as an individual when it's all said and done. But Coach Nick Saban is, I mean, by far one of the greatest coaches in history in terms of football. He's talented, he knows what he's doing, and he knows what to get. Listen, if you told me that they were going to come out and throw for 400+ yards in that game, and listen, I understand they have some of the best receivers in all of college football, but against an Ohio State defense that, if I'm being honest, their pass defense has been pretty good this year, I would have probably called you crazy. But yet, he stayed the game plan. The play calls were perfect. And then when it's all said and done, Eddie, Nick Saban, I mean, just like, for example, with Andy Reid of late, how you really seen him shine. I understand Ohio State wasn't the best team, but good teams win football games when they're playing to their best. And Nick Saban's play calling as a coach was to his best, which helped his football team dominate the national championship.
And Devontae Smith, I mean, talk about an impressive wide receiver. 215 yards in the first half, really deserving of that Heisman Trophy. And whoever can get him in the draft, they're going to be set up with quite the target for years to come. And I really think he's easily going to be right up there with Julio Jones, DeAndre Hopkins, and such as one of the elite NFL receivers going into the next few years. Last topic before our picks. I want to talk a little NASCAR. We're getting closer to the start of the season. It's just 19 days until the cars return to the track for the Clash at Daytona. But that Daytona 500 entry list kind of getting me excited because it's getting padded. There's currently 44 entries. It's looking like we could get up to 46 or 47. And in these past couple of years where the Daytona duels, the qualifying races, have just turned out to not really matter because there's been 40 people showing up for 40 spots or 41 for 40 spots. It's a good sign that NASCAR is kind of making a positive turn now. You could really see it over the past year or so that it seems like NASCAR is getting in a better position. Of course, Michael Jordan, and then the even more surprising that Pitbull is now investing in Team Trackhouse and Daniel Suarez this year. These are some big names that are not connected with NASCAR's, typical stereotypical fan base, that are making their way into the sport, helping them grow. And with just a year away until the next gen cars come around, I think this is a really positive sign for NASCAR that was finding themselves in a pretty difficult spot financially and with their fan base and with their ratings over the past few years before this.
Yeah, this is huge for NASCAR. Starting to get more cars on the track are huge, especially the fact that, through this whole movement, especially with BLM and NASCAR being very, very transparent and being, very big activists towards pushing change in the community. I think that's really helped NASCAR out. And listen, they listened to the fans this year. I'm excited to see what the racing is going to be, with the whole new quote unquote aero package, which is again the less downforce that we like, the higher horsepower. It's going to be exciting. But if I am being honest, there's one thing to me that may personally not be exciting, and that's when they first head to the track, and that's the Clash. Listen, the specialty of Daytona, opening quote-unquote speed weeks or setting up for speed weeks, that's the Daytona 24's job. That's the Rolex 24. Race the road course, let them have their fun. And I've been critiquing this since it was first announced they were doing it, but that's its own specialty event. And then all of NASCAR comes to the track and races all three series, and as well as ARCA, so I should really say four, even though it's on the NASCAR series, around the oval. The fact that the Clash is at the road course to me is a little bit underwhelming, but it is also a precursor to what we're going to see this year. And you mentioned the fact that into this year's Daytona 500, 44 cars signed up. I think that though has a little bit to do with the fact that, listen, we're getting ready for next generation of cars, and that these parts and everything else are starting to get a little bit cheaper. Not saying that it's exactly cheap to own a Cup Series team, but right now, until the new generation comes out, these teams are getting opportunities to make themselves apparent and expand a little bit. I don't think there are going to be permanent fixtures, however, in regards to the fact that we're going to see 40 cars a week unless NASCAR finds a way for pricing with this next gen to be efficient enough for all teams to afford it. But going into Daytona, I mean, it's going to be electric. Let's be honest. This is I'm already bought into, Eddie, by the way, the fact that the opening advertisement for this year is that this may be the best season ever. And it may be. There are so many factors going into this year that we have no idea what's going to. And if I'm going to be honest, I don't think we're going to see those one or two dominant drivers that we've seen over the last 3 years, particularly Kyle Busch, Kevin Harvick, Martin Truex Jr., and so on. I think that this year there's going to be a wide variety of drivers winning, and it's going to be a whole new type of field, needless to say, because going in every week with this, less downforce, that means now it's going to be more on the driver and less on the setup to find success on a weekly basis.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a great season. It's going to be fun to watch Bubba Wallace, Daniel Suarez, and others with these new teams to see how they compete. Of course, some big moves in the offseason as well for other guys. Eric Jones heading to RPM, Kyle Larson making his return. It's a lot of exciting stuff to watch this season in NASCAR. But I just want to say about the Clash, I'm not a proponent of the Clash whatsoever, because every way that you could spin it as it being, essential to speed weeks, I don't know if you really need it. Because first of all, it's the first thing that people used to say is that it's a good test for the draft. Well, first of all, testing in the draft, that you can have that in the duels, you can have that in all the practice sessions, and it's not like the guys who are going to be competing to make the Daytona 500 that actually depend on the duels will get that practice in the Clash, because it's only the pole winners and the playoff drivers, and typically those people are all already locked in to the Daytona 500. So that's the first thing. Second of all, now that's on a road course, some people are saying, just to extend speed weeks a little bit. Well, you still have the ARCA race on Wednesday, and I feel like that should almost get higher billing now by NASCAR, especially since NASCAR has now affiliated itself completely with ARCA. You'd think they'd try to, promote that a little bit more than just this clash. And just thinking about the last couple years, I know it's on a road course this season, it might be different, but the last couple clashes, the last two especially, have been embarrassments. 2 years ago with Jimmy Johnson wrecking Paul Menard on the only pass in the entire race to win it. And then this past year, everybody wrecking that stupid crash right off a restart where everybody spun out, and then Eric Jones's car smoking and being like the only car left at the end. It's not good NASCAR racing. It really doesn't set a good precedent for people to want to watch the races going forwards, because maybe the crashes will excite certain people who are excited to watch NASCAR for the accidents. But guess what? Those people are not going to stick around to watch a race in, May at Kansas. They just want to watch Daytona and Talladega, and that's not really going to help NASCAR continue to grow. So I don't know what the Clash's real purpose is at this point. I know it's a traditional thing, but then again, you just got rid of the tradition by moving into a road course. But I could go off about the Clash. We can talk more about Daytona when it gets closer, but it's time to make our predictions for the NFC and AFC championship games. Now, first of all, 3-1 for me last week, 3-1 for you last week. I now have a 5-game lead, so I can officially declare myself the champion of our pick'em for 2020. Very exciting, very exciting. But let's make our picks now. I'm going to start on the AFC side. Now, I am going to bank that Patrick Mahomes does end up playing on Sunday. I think they're going to go through everything necessary to get him on the field. And I think if he's there, I think the Chiefs are going to win this game. Now, I think the Bills are going to make adjustments and stop the run a little bit better, because they got imploded in that game against Kansas City. I know it was adjusted weird. It was a weird Monday, 5 o'clock in the afternoon game because of COVID, but I think it's going to be closer than that game was. But I think Kansas City pulls it out and moves on to their second consecutive Super Bowl. And I want to compare this Bills team quickly to the Chiefs 2 years ago. Their first appearance in the conference championship game where Patrick Mahomes was outplayed by Tom Brady. I think Buffalo's going to be a staple in these games for these next few years. I think this is their first little taste of it. I don't think they're going to get to the Super Bowl yet, but I think there's a lot to be excited about. Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs, and that Bills defense. There's a lot to be excited about these next couple of years, but I don't think it's going to happen just yet. I've got the Chiefs moving to the Super Bowl. Now, in the NFC, my original Super Bowl prediction from the beginning of the season that I stuck with till now, which I can't do anymore, was that New Orleans was going to win the Super Bowl and that this would be Drew Brees' swan song season. Now, it is a swan song season, but he's out now. So Packers against the Bucs. This is going to be a great game. I think this one's going to come down to the final couple of minutes, but I think the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are going to go into Lambeau Field and take down the Packers and move on to the Super Bowl, and Tom Brady is going to prove to Bill Belichick it was me that led the Patriots to all the success over the past 2 decades. I think it's going to be a very competitive game. Like you said, it's going to be an offensive shootout. Neither of these teams have particularly the best defenses. Aaron Rodgers has been lights out all year, especially at home. But I think Tampa Bay is going to take control, and Tom Brady is really going to kick in, and he's going to set up a Buccaneers-Chiefs Super Bowl, which would be super fun to watch. Tim, who's your picks?
I'm going to have to go back and actually see who my initial Super Bowl prediction was, because I actually don't remember, at least on the NFC side, who I had predicted to go to the Super Bowl. But I know for a fact I did pick Kansas City to go. However, I'm going to make my switch now. And I know it sounds crazy, but listen, Buffalo Bills fans, continue being special. And I'm going to go with you right here. Donating over $150,000 to Lamar Jackson's favorite charity. That is something unique that not many fans do, but it seems like the Buffalo Bills fans continue to do good things when good things happen to them. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to be a good thing if Patrick Mahomes doesn't clear concussion protocol, going into Sunday. But like you, Eddie, I assume he's going to be okay. But listen, Bills fans have been suffering for too long. I mean, how many opportunities at a Super Bowl can you squander throughout the years? I'm not saying this is the year for Buffalo to win it, but the progression's been there. And just like on the NFC side, this is an opportunity for a team that got destroyed, literally and figuratively, early in this year by the Kansas City Chiefs to get some vengeance. Listen, if they play the defense that they did in the first half against the Baltimore Ravens last week and do the same thing against Kansas City, we're going to be talking about a very close ball game. I have Buffalo winning this game by a field goal when it's all said and done over the Kansas City Chiefs to head to the Super Bowl and being the only true New York team to make the Super Bowl in a very long time. Now on the NFC side, I'm going to have to go with the Green Bay Packers. I know you're going with the Bucs, and by no means am I making these predictions to go opposed to you. But listen, I cannot go against the Rodgers rate. Aaron Rodgers needs his vengeance, and if I'm being honest, I want to see Aaron Rodgers in a Super Bowl. He deserves it. It's the fact of the matter is he's an angry man ever since Jordan Love has been drafted. And listen, this offense is really unstoppable. I'm not saying the Bucs defense is bad by any means. Listen, we know how Rodgers and Sue are as enemies. Needless to say, they don't get along very well. But this offense can find ways to be effective. I think they learn a lot from that loss earlier this season. Robert Tonyan is a threat in the red zone. Devontae Adams, no one, even Tampa Bay, in that really bad game was able to stop him. I think this offense finds ways to be effective, especially with Aaron Jones on the ground, and beats Tom Brady in the NFC Championship game.
Well, we've got some different picks. It's going to be fun to watch this weekend. Next Sunday, matchups Packers and Bucs and Chiefs and Bills. We'll be back next Friday. We'll recap everything that goes down in the conference championship games, plus all the latest in the NBA and the MLB. Then we'll probably do a Super Bowl preview after that, and then it'll be Daytona 500 weekend, and we'll get the NASCAR gang up in here for a Daytona 500 preview. So a lot to be excited about, so look forward to our next show on next Friday, January 29th. Until then, I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
Wishing you a great rest of your day here on Sports Speak.